It's my pleasure to get to introduce our speaker tonight, Wes Marshall, who will be discussing his book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer, with a special focus on what parking has to do with all of this. Wes is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a little conversation between our president, Tony Jordan, and Wes Marshall, and then we'll open it up to questions from webinar participants. So, as you're listening, as thoughts come to you, by all means, use that chat box and drop questions into that Q&A. So without further ado, Wes Marshall, PhD and professional engineer, is the professor of civil engineering with a joint appointment in urban and regional planning at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's also the director of the CU Denver Transportation Research Center and co-director of the Active Communities Transportation Research Group. He received his professional engineering license in 2003 and focuses on transportation teaching and research dedicated to creating a more sustainable and resilient world, particularly in terms of road safety. Having spent time in the private sector, Wes has been working on these issues for more than 25 years. With over 80 peer-reviewed publications, Wes was also the winner of the campus-wide University of Colorado Denver Outstanding Faculty and Research Award. I will share the link in the chat to get Wes's book, but without further ado, please welcome Wes Marshall to talk about it.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Tony and Kevin. Let me see if I can share my screen here. How's that look? People can see
Works for me.
All right. So, gonna be talking about my book, and obviously it's a book about safety, and the question of what has parking got to do with it. I think to help understand that, and maybe even to understand sort of where Donald Shoup fits in, I thought it would help to start to some extent with my origin story. So I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts. It was a town founded a couple hundred years before traffic engineers ever existed. And to me as a kid, like this was the big road next to my street where I grew up. So there was one lane of traffic in each direction and on-street parking on the other side. I measured this in Google Earth last night, and it was 34 feet curb to curb. And if you turn the other way, this would be considered the big intersection I have to cross to get to like my favorite pizza place or the corner store that had candy and sandwiches. Did these places have dedicated parking? No. And guess what? Those two things are actually still in business today. But still, this was the so-called big intersection, and it was just two streets with one lane in each direction. And I never thought much about transportation back then, but we still avoided those slightly bigger roads when we could, and we mostly biked and walked on streets like this. So this is, right parallel to my street, 24 feet curb to curb, but it felt smaller and slower because it had parking on both sides. So this is not a picture of me and my friends, but we felt like we could bike anywhere in our town. And if I wanted to venture out further, I could jump on the bus and get to Fenway Park or Harvard Square. And from there, the red line could take me anywhere. I then went to Charlottesville, Virginia, and went to UVA. I got a degree in civil engineering. Again, transportation was not my focus. And even though Charlottesville spent pretty much the entirety of my 4 years there widening 29 that cuts through the city, we were very much insulated from it. But one thing I did notice was that traffic on 29 was just as bad, if not worse, when I left Charlottesville as compared to when I got there. So I went back to Watertown. I started working in a civil engineering firm, one that was considered probably a progressive firm. I was doing site engineering type work, and that meant to some extent being a jack of all trades. So doing some transportation, hydrology, geotech, structural. But when I think about my frustrations at the time, it was mostly with the transportation. The things we were building were never as good as the things I saw around me. I was given, half dozen of those 1,000-page manuals to use. And nowhere in those manuals could I ever come close to building something like this. This is Acorn Street in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. And it's like 6 or 8 feet curb to curb here. And this is a place people love. I mean, those manuals wouldn't let me design the streets like the ones near where I grew up, or even come close to replicating, places like Com Ave. And this image shows half of Com Ave with, there's a train in the median, there's through movement on each side, and then access lanes for bicyclists and parking on the outside. And all of these buildings, very few of them have off-street parking. I then changed jobs to a more traditional civil engineering firm, and I moved to Connecticut. And this is the first time I ever lived in a place where I could not leave my street without being in a car. big roads and big parking lots is honestly as far as the eye could see. Sidewalks and bike facilities were non-existent. I moved near here. This is a smaller town in Connecticut, thinking it would be better. And even though the adjacent street was much smaller, as you see here, it still wasn't one where anyone would really feel safe walking or biking. And that it drove me crazy. So, I was a 10-minute walk to this corner store, and there was no way for me to walk there or bike there. I would ask my neighbors how they live like this, and nobody really understood what I was talking about. They just drive. And to myself, I'm thinking like they don't really know what they are missing. So these frustrations led me to apply to graduate school. And I did so soon after getting my PE. And even though I chose UConn mostly due to their great health insurance for grad students, I was extremely fortunate to end up working with Dr. Norman Garrick, who I believe he's still on the Parking Reform Network Advisory Board. Anyway, if you look at Norman's work history, you'll see that he was about to become a visiting professor in Jamaica the exact time I showed up in Storrs, Connecticut. So he put me on a parking project and he left town. And my thinking at the time, like, what? Parking? Like, this will be boring. But prior to leaving, he gave me one name, this. And this was before the high cost of free parking came out. So I spent that first year digging into all of Donald Shoup's research on parking, transportation, in cities. And, as you probably know, like books like Parking Generation came out like in the mid 80s, similar to ITE's Trip Generation book, but here we're trying to estimate parking spaces. And like as traffic engineers, like you think there's so much science behind everything you do. And I started reading Donald Shoup's work, and it just wasn't the case. So, one of my first lessons from Dr. Shoup's work is the shocking lack of science behind, numbers like this, like the 10.60 per 1,000 square feet. And I was creating PowerPoint slides like this back in 2004, where I would show, well, this would be what 10.60 is, but when you look at the data, it's really more like this. So in early 2005, I wrote this paper called Parking at Mixed Use Centers in Small Cities. It ended up getting published in Transportation Research Record. In that work, we compared 3 New England town centers that were built well before parking ordinances, and probably well before traffic engineers for that matter ever existed. And we compared those to 3 more contemporary town centers built after the parking regs became the norm. I was taking a GIS course at the time, so I used this research as a basis for one of my term projects. And doing so sort of flipped some of the focus of the project. Because the parking problems we were hearing about from the surveys, like we did these surveys, we're asking people in these places about parking, about their perception of it. And a lot of them were saying we need more, blah, blah, blah. But when you started looking at things on a more comprehensive, more holistic level, you saw the opposite. And when you see an image like this, the pink is the parking. There's how much parking, how much land we're consuming by parking, and how little of it is by buildings or anything else. You start understanding things very differently. Like, and then we went out. I mean, I went out dozens of times to these 6 different town centers to try to find the busiest day of the year and count how many cars were actually there. And well, yes, in this one example here, there's one lot that was pretty full. Overall, most of the parking was very empty. So when we compared the old place and the new places, like both the old and new cities, like their parking regulations would mandate about the same level of parking, based on the amount of their zoning regulations and stuff. And it was about 5 or 5.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. But what was really interesting is just how different the amount of parking provided was. Like the newer sites were providing about double the parking than the older sites. And neither of them were anywhere really quite close to what the regulations would require. When we started looking at peak usage, especially in the newer sites, it was less than half of what was provided on the busiest day of the year we could find. And on an average busy summer day, it was nowhere near that either. So, the question comes up is like, why would we ever want to provide more parking than is necessary? But I think we all know the answers to it. I mean, cities, shoppers, businesses don't want to be discouraged by a lack of parking. Neighborhoods don't want to be inundated by spillover. We don't want to lose shoppers due to a lack of free parking. So the conventional answers to parking always revolved around the idea of a factor of safety. More parking might cost us a little bit more, but we'll be safer that way. In other words, we were scared of stories like this one, where it says Britain ran out of parking spaces, or this one. So being conservative meant providing more parking than we think we need. So why do we do this? One reason is fear of the things we're just talking about. Another reason is that transportation engineering is a subdiscipline of civil engineering. So when I was an undergraduate, I took courses in structural and hydrology and geotech. In courses like that, I was taught to figure out, the design load, multiply it by 3 to give us a factor of safety. Bigger beam like this one might cost us more, but we know it's going to be safer. And this factor of safety mentality seeps through all of civil engineering, which makes sense when it comes to a culvert or maybe a bridge in terms of the structural design or a building. But the factor of safety mindset and that approach doesn't work as well in transportation. Why? Well, Mother Nature doesn't care how big our beam is or how big the culvert is. It's not going to be any windier. And the difference is if we put a wider road or more parking in front of a human, they're going to behave differently. Like it doesn't work as well when we provide more parking than we need or think we need. It doesn't work for a street. Like here's an example with a 245-foot curb to curb. If we're assuming 3.5 feet per second for pedestrian, that's more than 70 seconds to cross. And if human beings behave exactly the same on a narrow road as they do this one, it makes sense that we might be safer, but we know they don't. And that example I just gave actually comes from a new urbanist community in China. Like we're now up to the 6th edition of parking generation. And even though it doesn't use the word minimum like many of our other manuals and guidebooks, that is exactly how things are interpreted in practice. Like we might think we only need 20 parking spaces based on the regulations, but we have room for more. Maybe we have some extra money. So why not 25 or 30? Like related to this, and I think I mentioned this in the book, I remember when I was designing a parking lot when I was a young engineer, in the city code said, I think the access lanes needed to be in this off-street parking lot needed to be 22 feet wide. So we had a little extra space. We had some money to go to 24 feet wide. So we did so under the erroneous thinking that we provided the world with a little bit of a factor of safety. And that is the mindset when engineers look at parking ordinances, like that we need at least this much parking, which, as I think most of you know here, leads us to places like this one. This is near me here in Colorado. This is an office supply store that dedicates nearly 6 times more land to parking than the building. And this is an apartment building I pass when I bike to work all the time. There's 7 floors of parking and only 5 floors of housing. And I'm taking this picture from a surface lot across the street, and you see another surface lot to the left there of the building. So after I finished writing that first academic paper, the high cost of free parking came out, which inspired me to work on a second parking related paper. And that paper ended up winning like the Transportation Research Board Paper of the Year award. So it was awesome to see how, there was a small cohort of people really excited about parking. I'll quickly just cover this a little bit. Like that paper started off with some of the land consumption data that I got from the GIS, where we noticed that on average, when we include things like the access lanes and the driveways and the landscaping, we were consuming less land per parking space at the older town centers. It was around 470 square feet per space versus 530 square feet per space. And I mean, that difference doesn't seem like a big deal. But when we are talking about, in this case, town centers with 2,000 parking spaces on average, like that adds up to about 3.5 acres of extra land that needs to be consumed by parking. When we started to think about why, it became clear that the older sites relied far more on on-street parking than the other ones that was much more surface parking related. What was interesting too is when we started looking into the history of on-street parking, it was just thought to be a safety detriment. It was thought to, it increased congestion, restricted street capacity, a waste of street space, all the other stuff. But the safety one was interesting because there really wasn't a lot of research to show that. But it got to the point where even cities that you would imagine would put their on-street parking on a postcard would start banning it. So what we found, one of the things we found was that on-street parking helps slow drivers down. So, and these pictures don't look like similar roads, but when we looked at similar roads, we had much faster speeds on the roads with on-street parking, all other things held the same. Was there also a difference in safety outcomes? Well, yes, we found that there were about 7% more fender benders on streets with on-street parking, all other things being held equal, but we had almost 3 times more fatal and severe crashes on streets without the on-street parking. And when a crash happened, the chances of it being fatal or severe injury are much higher on the street without the on-street parking. While I was actually working in this paper, I was at UConn at the time. So UConn removed on-street parking from this road to cut through campus. And they did this for the sake of safety, even though what they created seemed more like a highway. Soon thereafter, a freshman student, Carly Wines, she was killed in a hit and run on the street. Obviously, people were up in arms. And what do we do to make it safe again? We just put up a sign. All right, so next it came time for my dissertation topic. And here's again Watertown, where I grew up. As you might remember, it's from 1630. It's an organic grid that let me walk or bike all over town as a kid. And back when I was a young engineer, a lot of my colleagues were moving out to towns, for example, like Chelmsford, to get away from all the traffic. But what fascinated me was that whenever I went out there, there was so much traffic in Chelmsford. At least it felt that way because whenever you hit the traffic, you were stuck with no alternative options. Like in Watertown, I could just move over a street whenever I hit a problem, and those options weren't available in these tree-like street networks in Chelmsford. At the same time, they were telling me that, well, it's safer to like live out there in a cul-de-sac. My kids will be safer, all that sort of stuff. And like here you can see Watertown's organic grid versus Chelmsford more tree-like one. And the basic question is like, is that true? Like, is it true? Like, was there research pointing us in that direction in terms of safety? And if you look at the history of gridded street networks, like we built them that way for 2,000 years. And then during the 1900s, we quickly changed paths and things started to become more disconnected. And over time, they became sparser. So I wanted to know why we ended up this way and if these folks were really safer out there. And this again is when I started applying like some of those lessons I learned from Donald Shoup's work to see if there was much science behind why we made this shift. And turns out it wasn't much behind it. So back in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, so the FHA, created these publications recommending specific street patterns where they like formally endorse these tree-like networks with cul-de-sacs, and they called grids a safety issue. And they literally said bad and good next to these. They doubled down in 1938. You can see bad and good next to each of these. And you're probably asking, like, who cares about the Federal Housing Administration? But they were not only responsible for providing and insuring mortgages, but they reviewed subdivision plans and made recommendations based on those standards. And I think they played a role, what's the number, like 22 million properties before 1960. Like it wasn't until the 1950s when transportation engineers really even looked at this, and when we started recommending street hierarchies and like functional classification and doing things like cul-de-sacs and disconnected networks, and there was not much research to support it. Like the one research paper that I still heard about when I presented on this topic when I was a PhD student was this 1957 study by Harold Mark, Subdividing by Traffic Safety. It was funded by ITE. It looked at 5 years of data in just a bunch of neighborhoods in LA, and they found more crashes on the gridded streets and more crashes at the four-way intersections than T intersections. But they neglected so much, like crash severity, crash migration. So they were just looking at these disconnected networks and not the arterials needed to support them. They also neglected traffic controls. There was no stop signs, there was no yield signs, there was no traffic signals at these four-way stops in these intersections. Like that is what we ended up going with. Like this was the science that was behind all of what we were doing. And this was the science that was being brought up to me when I was showing you, I'll show you some of those results quickly, that we found different answers. And like even though like this isn't parking, like this, what I felt it was, just as scientific, which means barely at all, as books like Parking Generation. So I started looking at road fatality rates for hundreds of these medium-sized cities. And when you do that, you start seeing how they range from basically zero up to what would be on par with some of the more dangerous cities in the world. And then you split up these into like the older and the newer cities. You see that a lot of the safer cities were built before traffic engineers existed. and a lot of the more dangerous ones were built after we came into play. I ended up looking at 24 medium-sized California cities, the 12. I tried to pick the 12 safest and 12 most dangerous, but there was a little bit of leeway for geography and some other things we're trying to hold constant. Ended up geocoding hundreds of thousands of crashes over a period of more than a decade. And even though we couldn't get the off-street parking data we wanted, we controlled for as many variables as possible. And we found that, yes, your cul-de-sac is safer if you never leave it. But the sort of big arterials that are needed to support cul-de-sac style designs, and those areas are killing far more people than the grid of street networks. So yes, the grid of street networks might have about 9% more fender benders, but they had far fewer severe injuries, far fewer fatalities. People tended to use actual transportation a lot more in the compact grid of neighborhoods. And those that lived there also drove a lot less. And you see differences ranging from like 15 vehicle miles traveled per person per day up to 35. And when you think about those numbers, like sometimes when you compare something like a 19 miles per person per day to 20, it doesn't seem like a lot. But when you're talking about a city of like 100,000 people and you extrapolate that over a year, we're talking, like 27 million miles. And papers like this that got into like the health differences, they came later. So when I was on the job market looking for jobs, I didn't have a lot of papers that weren't parking papers. And at the time, I knew I was on the short list at a prestigious university, and I ended up hearing years later that one of the transportation engineering professors said this in their search committee meeting about me, is we don't want a parking guy. And that's when I started to realize how little the so-called experts really knew about how transportation works, because the people in this room know how much parking matters to a lot of the fundamentals that we are trying to work towards, and it's much more so than people think. Like, for example, around the same time when I was in the job market, we had a transit project on the island of Nantucket off the coast of Cape Cod, and they wanted to better understand why everybody in their island was driving and why so few people were using their transit system. One suggestion we had was rebranding it because it was called the NERTA, the Nantucket Regional Transit Authority. It wasn't all that endearing. And they later renamed it the WAVE. Another issue was signage. So there is a bus stop here. It's hard to see, still hard to see. And when you look closely, like these little stripes on this wooden pole were all they're willing to put up to tell people this was a bus stop. And the colors were just to let people know where the buses would go. So this is a town that hates signage except when it comes to parking signs. So the interesting thing too is that they would charge people for the bus, but parking in downtown Nantucket was free. They didn't end up charging for parking like we recommended, but they did, I think 15 years later, make the bus free. But still, cruising for parking, it's a big problem in Nantucket, and it includes all the workers who need to move their car every 2 hours. And if you look up, on Google, how long it takes to get from one end of the island to the other, the driving time does not include how long it takes to find parking. It doesn't include how long it takes to walk to your destination from wherever you end up parking. Here's another shot of Nantucket's downtown parking situation. But here's an example of how parking doesn't matter much to traffic engineers either, because like beyond the anecdotal evidence that very few civil engineering departments wanted a parking guy, if a crash happens here in a parking lot and somebody dies, that fatality is not going to end up in our FARS database because it's in a parking lot and not on a public street. And if we tell a kid to bike here in this Sharrow, and then a parking related door crash happens, like you see here, most cities do not record this in our crash database because it's a dooring crash and there was no moving car in it. So oftentimes a crash like this that's caused by parking doesn't end up in our databases. A bike crash here would end up in our database, but you see a Sharrow on this highway, we would blame this on the road users instead of the engineer. And that is the tip of the iceberg of the problems I was trying to fix with this book. So I was building off some of what I learned from that early Donald Shoup work. And I don't think I even sort of put two and two together at the time, but I dug into hundreds of old traffic engineering books and journals. Like you see here, Traffic Quarterly is one of the big journals that ran from like 1947 through the early 2000s. They had like 2,400 plus papers and editorials. And I really wanted to understand what traffic engineers were thinking at the time, because I wanted to know why we were doing what we were doing. Um, Obviously, I read all the safety papers, but when I was making my notes of what papers to read, I read all the parking ones too. This was one of the early parking ones I found. It was the only second paper I could find that was written by a woman. This was 7 years after the journal started. But she describes the need for Gloucester, Massachusetts to pave over their waterfront and turn it into a parking lot. She called it something like hot topping the harbor. And coincidentally, Nantucket also wanted to buy up some waterfront land and build a parking garage. But I think we successfully talked them out of that idea. Here's another parking related paper I found. This one was from 1964. It set out to bust all the pesky myths about transportation. The second myth he busts for us is basically don't worry about induced demand, it's not real. Moreover, though, adding more parking, it's not going to induce any more driving either. There's another paper I found around the same time was basically saying that the most serious problems downtowns have is the lack of parking facilities at a rate equal to demand. So too many cities have fallen behind and are inadequate. So the best thing we can do to correct these deficiencies is add more parking and add more freeways. And where should we put those freeways? Where should we put that parking to make our city adequate? Paul Hoffman, at the time, he was known as like the civic leader of the safety movement. He said that we should look for blighted areas to add these parking facilities. And there was that, I think, of the same 1964 paper that says, don't just focus on the blighted areas because the old concept of using freeways and parking to clear slums is too limited. Instead, we should just look for any part of the city that has a lack of on-street parking. Like that's where we need to build the freeways. That's where we need to add more off-street parking. And prior to becoming the self-proclaimed civic leader of the road safety movement, Paul Hoffman was the CEO of Studebaker. And in the mid 1930s, Paul Hoffman wasn't happy that cars were being made to look unsafe. So this is road fatalities per 100,000 population. He starts in like 1900 or so, and you see up to the mid 1930s when he was thinking about this issue. He was convinced that the bad publicity about traffic crashes would hurt car sales. And even though he made the right point that we need an exposure metric, he simply picked the one he liked best that would help make cars look nice and safe for years to come. And he wrote a book about it. So using Paul's new approach, where we measured road safety in terms of road fatalities per vehicle miles traveled, now safety looks like it's heading in the right direction. He wrote this book, I think it is right there behind me, 1939, and then he barnstormed the country selling this new metric to this burgeoning new discipline of traffic engineering. And when you compare, this is the same metric we use today. So road fatalities per 100 million VMT is what we still use today. And if you ask a traffic engineer how we're doing on safety, they might show you a graph like this and say mission accomplished, right? But let's just think about what this metric means. Using that metric, let's say we have a town with 16 fatalities or a city with 16 fatalities. Let's say these folks that live there drove 4 million miles that year. Like this would be that metric, fatalities per million VMT, so 4. What does parking have to do with this? Well, these are some results. A friend of mine, Chris McCahill, he was a PhD student of Norman Garrick's right after I left, and he kind of continued some of that parking research. He meticulously measured how much parking various cities had at various points in their history. One of his papers, he showed that adding parking was causal in terms of more driving. In other words, more parking led to more driving and not the other way around. In this graph, you can see that if you double the amount of parking, you get about a 7.5 or 8 percentage point increase in driving mode share. So what I'm going to show you here, these are some back of the envelope numbers I did based on Chris's work. Like this is not even the book, but I was trying to understand, well, what if we double the amount of parking in our hypothetical city? We know based on Chris's work, it'll lead to more driving, right? So we have more driving now. And if we have more driving, the way the crash rate works, there's 2 ways to get safety. One is we reduce fatalities. The other way is to increase driving. All of a sudden, we look like we're safer than we were before because we have more driving, because we added more parking. In fact, we could have 17 people die instead of 16, and it would still seem like we improve safety based on the way we're looking at these metrics. So one of the things I see as problematic is that traffic engineers we're measuring the wrong thing. Here's another example that compares two places. You can see both of them have 16 fatalities. One of them has 4 million miles traveled, the other is 2. So if you compare these two places with our typical metric, the one on the top right looks twice as safe as the one on the bottom left. But if we think about safety more like we do every other human health impact, when we measure cancer rates, we don't do it per DMT, we're doing it per population. So if this top city has 100,000 people, the fatalities per 100,000 population is 16. Let's say the bottom city is 200,000, and the fatalities per 100,000 population is half. Now, when you compare these two cities, the one in the lower left is twice as safe as the other one. And most humans would define real safety as the bottom one, right? But the bigger problem is that we are building our communities as if the top number is safer, because that's what our data is telling us. That's what our metrics are telling us. I mean, after all, dying on the roads is definitely not good for your health. But if you think about the way that traffic engineers measure safety, where more driving makes us seem safer, it makes a tiny bit more sense why cities like Houston would do this to themselves, or Denver. Denver, this is the same view. It's much better here, but still, the United States, when you think about this thing on a grander level, like you think we're the world leaders in so many different things, but when it comes to safety, we are dead last if we measure safety like a health impact. And we're comparing ourselves in this instance to all the other OECD countries. So, how do we fix this? What's not happening here? I mean, typically, what do engineers do? We find a bad intersection, we throw a big band-aid on it, and hopefully the problem goes away. But when you zoom out and look at every city's high injury network, which typically shows, 50 or 60% of your road fatalities take place on 5 or 6% of your city's streets, those same streets tend to be the most traffic engineered of our streets. They tend to be the ones where we have big arterial roads surrounded by big parking lots, and there are not enough band-aids to fix those sort of problems. So I love my friends and colleagues at the Colorado DOT, but I gave a presentation there a few years ago, and when I logged into the Wi-Fi, this was their password. I'm sorry if they have to change it, but when you look at the infrastructure that they're providing and the fact that we're surrounding these things with big parking lots, I'd say we're at best safety third. So why isn't this working? Other cities, what are they doing? What are they trying to do? They're trying to declare Vision Zeros. Vision Zero for most cities, Vision Zero is little more than a catchphrase, which reminds me of this clip here.
I declare bankruptcy! No, you just say the word bankruptcy and expect anything to happen. I didn't say it, I declared it. Still, it's not anything.
Hopefully you could hear that. If not, Michael Scott is declaring bankruptcy after having some money problems. And after initially confusing bankruptcy with the witness protection program, he just yells, I'm declaring bankruptcy. And then Oscar comes to tell him, well, that's really not anything. Like, that's not enough. But that's kind of what we're doing in most cities. We're still approaching it with business as usual. If you look at nationally, we did this towards zero death thing back in 2011. And a lot of the states, so the DOTs have to submit to the federal government, like what their goal is for the next year in terms of like pedestrian and bicyclist deaths. And some of the numbers they were submitting were higher than the year before. So again, how do we fix this? A lot of people would say follow the data. Here's a quote from Michael Bloomberg: "In God we trust, everyone else bring data." And that's exactly what places like Boulder, Colorado did. They were one of the early adopters of Vision Zero. I saw them do a presentation on this. And in the presentation, they start off with our 3 E's for safety. We all know engineering, education, enforcement. Those are sort of the big three that we, for 100 years, been trying to fix safety with. They added a fourth E to the pod. They added evaluation. And when they dug through the data, what did they find? Well, they found that most of our crashes are caused by human error. And if human error is the problem, what's the solution? Usually we think technology is going to be the panacea. but they've been saying the same thing for decades, and we're still not much closer to this. Here's a recent study that came out a couple months ago saying that self-driving cars are safer except at dawn, at dusk, and whenever they make a turn. So anyways, what do? We look at the data. If technology is not going to fix it and we have a human error problem, the easiest thing to think is we need to fix those human errors. We need to help correct those behaviors, which is why we need to focus on things like education and enforcement. So a lot of Vision Zero cities will start by cracking down on all those pesky jaywalkers or scofflaw cyclists. New York City, for instance, issued, I think, more tickets to bicyclists than truck drivers, even though 43 people were killed by truck drivers and I think only one was fatally hit by a bicyclist. Um, anyways, the problem with enforcement, it usually is temporary. Things go back to the status quo pretty quickly. We have plenty of evidence on racial disparities, blah, blah, blah. So the easier thing to do is look for the education side. When Boulder did that, they gave us a safety is a shared responsibility type catchphrase. And Colorado DOT did some fun ones telling us that as a pedestrian, it's our responsibility to make eye contact with the driver. Same goes for dogs. And that intersection literally right behind me there is where they had these folks go out there in these eyeball heads and walk around. What does this mean for the 1.2 legally blind people in this country, or the 12 million people that are visually impaired? Who knows? But it's sure fun to dress up in these eyeball heads and walk around. But it feels like we did our job. So we repeatedly tell people they need to be safe and obey the rules. And if people just did what they were asking, we would be safe. So traffic engineers walking away again feeling like this. The reality of human error is not that simple. So what is really behind these crashes? So here's an example. You're on an urban arterial, like we saw some of those ones before on the high injury network, and you have a permissive left turn signal. So you have a green ball. So you can take a left turn if you can find a gap in the traffic. So as a driver, what are you doing? You're scanning ahead, looking for a gap in the traffic. You might have some cars behind you, so you kind of feel a back pressure. What are we doing at that exact same moment? We're telling a pedestrian it's their turn to cross safely. So there's a little white walk symbol for them, but we've sufficiently distracted the driver where it's hard for them to look for the pedestrian. But if this happens, how does this crash get classified in our crash database? It's a human error crash. Like, to me, we put all these folks in a bad situation. And when you look at the data, we'll say, well, we need to tell these road users to be more careful. But at the same time, the onus should be on traffic engineers to do better. Not only that, like, we know the A pillars in the way, so they couldn't even see this pedestrian a lot of times if they wanted to. Here's another quick example from Vancouver, Washington. I saw, for whatever reason, a news story about this crash happening the morning it happened, and I tried to follow it throughout the day. Two kids, pedestrians walking to school, were hit and killed. So they were jaywalking. They were killed by a driver in this truck. Here's the intersection where it happened. They were 14 and 17. How does that crash get classified in our database? It's a simple jaywalking crash. Like, the pedestrians did not yield the right of way to the driver. Jaywalking crash, we need to give them more education or enforcement. But if you think about things a little bit more holistically and zoom out just a tiny bit, and you look at the situation we put these kids in, like, here's the street they're on. That's where they cross in the middle. The nearest crosswalk is at least a quarter of a mile away. And if they walk to that crosswalk, it's not exactly a great one. I wouldn't love crossing there. The other one's not much better. And if you look at the pedestrian environment we gave these kids between where they were and that crosswalk, like, there's some sidewalks, but there's a lot of places where they're missing. You can see here, if you look right there, you can't even walk through there. So then you have these big turning radii at the corner where if you're trying to cross, along this street, you're going to have cars turning quickly on you. So why did these kids do what they do? It's because of the built environment we provided for them. It makes perfect rational sense why they did what they did when you think about it this way. They lived here, your school's over here, we gave them crappy crosswalks, crappy sidewalks. Of course they did that. And then we have the gall to tell them that they were wearing dark clothing. Of course they were. They were high school boys. So to me, again, the onus needs to be on us to do better as traffic engineers, or me, not all of you are traffic engineers, but what's the problem with all this? Like, one, I think it lets the traffic engineers off the hook. The other is we never learn from our mistakes. We take away the feedback loop. So how do we fix all this? Towards the end of the book, I try to come up with a bigger picture approach to where to start. And I talk about Marie Kondo's book, Tidying Up. And the idea is that instead of playing whack-a-mole like we do with safety, the idea is to do what she does. So she focuses on categories like clothing. So Marie Kondo wants us to put all of our clothes in one place so we can get a sense of the scale of the problem. Parking is the perfect example of something like that, where we need to look at all together in order to get a sense of the scale of the problem. Here's a city. This is Rochester, New York. This is right in their downtown. This won that Parking Creator Award a few years ago. Here's Detroit, Michigan. They tried to wipe out their obsolete gridded pattern and replace it with big roads and parking. And they did this in part in the name of trying to improve road safety. So to paraphrase Marie Kondo, like, what places spark joy? What kind of streets spark joy? If we listen to what people think about this, like, what places spark joy? What kind of streets do? And we do that for a wide variety of people, particularly the people that like live, work, and play in an area, and then try to figure out what goes into building such places. You start to get a different idea of what our places need to look like. Because good science is good observation. Like, what do these places have? What are the sidewalks like? What are the street trees like? How much parking do they provide? If you think carefully about the roles that these things play in these places, and a lot of times the crash data will match it. The places people love are usually the safer places. So it gets us to a point oftentimes where we need to get rid of the things we don't need, like extra car lanes or like extra parking, and bringing in more of what we do, like bigger and better sidewalks or bike lanes, in order to achieve that vision. As Marie Kondo says, the best way to find out what we really need is to get rid of what we don't. And even though it's an engineering book, I don't have very many equations at all in the book, but I do have this one when I talk about things we can focus on: kids plus active transportation plus transit minus parking equals safer places. I add proximity so we can lower the exposure rate on the next chapter, but this is one of the equations that's in the book. All right, so it's important to keep in mind that crashes, safety, it's all the byproduct of sort of the quantity and quality of our exposure in the transportation system. And these things are not independent. Like how much we drive, like that exposure we have is a rational human response to the transportation and the land use situation that we put in front of people. And that includes how much parking we provide and how much we charge for the parking. It seems simple, but if we look back at our history, we ripped out the kind of places that would reduce exposure quantity and increase its quality in favor of disconnected networks with big arterials and big parking lots and big highways. Like, we ripped out the road not taken, which I would argue was the safer road. And sadly, that's left us in a situation where I've been tracking the number of deaths on US roads through the years. And if you extrapolate, the data is not out yet, but if we follow the same trends, we would have hit 4 million deaths earlier this year. And it's hard to put that kind of number in perspective. And that doesn't include all the people that were severely injured or incapacitated for the rest of their life, and all the families that went through so much hardship because of this sort of stuff. And it's an underestimated problem. We sort of treat crashes and traffic safety as the cost of doing business. We treat it like a faucet dripping and not the fire hose that it really is. So that's all I have. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. I would now like to welcome Tony Jordan, the president of PRN, to join in here, and we're going to do a little back and forth conversation between Tony and Wes Marshall. And just a reminder to everyone, continue to share any questions that you've got in the Q&A. We'll dig into some user submitted questions in a little bit.
That was fantastic. And you were right. Oops, let me get my mic ready here. Thank
There
you.
you
That
go.
was
There we
that was
go.
fantastic. Yeah.
You definitely did before, just to say, when we met before the meeting, Wes looked at my questions that I was planning to ask him and was like, I think I'm gonna answer a bunch of these, and I think you did, but I think we still got some great ones, and there are some great questions in the Q&A. So I'll try and keep this, I'll try and select for what we think. So one is, I'll just jump to what I think maybe our members might get the most out of, to just cut right to the chase here. I really appreciate in your book that you make several direct calls to action. I think a lot of times books and just folks in general that expose problems don't really encourage people to go work on the problem. And you make a couple great calls for this. So you say, one thing you say is that we need to create the demand for asking the right questions about safety and properly, and this is a paraphrase, and properly applying those answers. I should have looked up the exact quote you said, but you're kind of like, you need to make that demand. So who's working in this space, both professionally like NACTO or other groups, and from the grassroots, and what's missing? Like who are you talking about that? And yeah.
Let me just explain what I mean a little bit. Like, so if we're, if a new development goes in, and I think a lot of you deal with like NIMBY type folks, what are they going to do? They're going to ask for a traffic study, right? And that traffic study is intended to do what? Try to look at before and after traffic. So they're using trip generation, they're using parking generation to try to figure out the impact, and then they're trying to mitigate that. So that's something almost every city is asking for whenever we do anything. No city is asking for a before and after like road safety evaluation. Like, what would be the difference in terms of safety, not just safety for drivers, but safety for pedestrians or bicyclists, or how hard it might be for a kid to walk to school when you expand this roadway to mitigate your traffic police, right? So because of that, we're not really teaching it in school. Like, most traffic engineers couldn't even do that, or they wouldn't even know where to start to even answer those questions. Like, what would be the before and after safety effects of doing X, Y, or Z? They don't know. We don't teach it. And what I'm trying to say there is because no one's asking for it. No cities are, no advocates are. So who is asking for it? For a while, it felt like I was the lone voice in the wilderness in this book, but I think now that it's getting out there, hopefully there'll be more people wanting to it. So I'm not sure who to say yet, but I just wanted to be more.
Great. We need some sort of, I think a lot of times like the Parking Reform Network kind of, there's more of this organizing activism going on, and just to say, like, I do think you also talk about cross-disciplinary activity a lot, and one of the things I think parking reform is great for is it does tie into, like this kind of work, or freeway fighting, housing, all these issues that are really interrelated. So on the grassroots side, you did say that, you also say you don't have to be a professional to make a difference. And you do speak highly of engineers who've crossed over from other disciplines, like, as I mentioned. What can lay persons do to have an impact and be taken seriously with professionals? And are there lanes that folks should stay in, or lines that shouldn't be crossed? At CNU, I saw you had the whole session around how to talk to engineers, but yeah, like how can we courteously be critical? Or yeah.
So I think there's a couple ways to think about it. Like, one is, like, we all have a different role to play, right? So I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, so I'm doing those things. If I become an advocate, that devalues my research. It's like when, you see a research paper and it's funded by big oil, nobody cares, right? Nobody gives that research paper the time of day. So if I'm perceived being an advocate, it doesn't, my research gets devalued, right? So what I want to do is provide ammunition to advocates like yourself that are sort of on the front lines of this stuff. So we all sort of have a different role to play in that world. At the same time, I mean, I want people to understand that you can be a transportation engineer even if a lot of people could never picture themselves as an engineer. It's not really in their realm of possibilities, but we need engineers that can go to a public meeting and talk to a community about what it feels like to have a highway cut through there, or what it feels like to have your house taken away. Like, there's so much more than I think what people think engineers are doing. Like, we're not sitting there doing math all day, right? It's not that. So we have, it's a long story, but we have a degree, a master's program where you don't need quite as many prereqs to get this degree. It's because we have a GIS degree within civil. But anyways, because of that, I've had some students come to me that didn't have civil degrees. So two of my best students happen to both have biology undergraduate degrees. Like one had a double major with French, the other had a minor in French literature. Totally coincidental, but they turned out to be two of my best students. Yes, they had to take 4 or 5 prereqs to get through it, but every other engineering school was telling them they needed to take like 20. And that's a hard no for a lot of people. But if you have to take 4 or 5, it seems more doable. And now they're both great professionals in this space. So we need more people coming to engineering that maybe never would have thought of themselves as an engineer.
Excellent. Well, I guess the end of that last question about are there lines to cross kind of ties into this next one, which I also saw some in the chat, which is um, you mentioned, I think maybe once or twice in the book, but don't talk too much around tactical urbanism. Do you think it's a good idea? And because I know also we have parking days coming up. There's all is it a good idea for ordinary citizens to go install their own crosswalks or bollards? And I don't want you to get in trouble professionally, or anything, but is there any warning or advice you have for people who want to, feel like the city's not moving fast enough and maybe they need to take matters into their own hands?
Like, to be honest, I'm trying to get traffic engineers and transportation engineers to embrace that mentality. Like, so I teach a sustainable transportation graduate course. One of the assignments I do is a tactical urbanism experiment. We actually have to go out and do something and measure some kind of before and after. And when I first started it, I had, some professor friends at other universities that tell me I'm nuts. Like, can't do that. Like, you're gonna get fired. And then one of them that would, for years, she told me I was nuts. She started doing it. She happened to also be on Federal Highways committee, and they were at the time coming up with I think a bike ped curriculum. They ended up adding my assignment to that curriculum. So Federal Highway has my tactical urbanism assignment in their kind of official curriculum now. So it's sort of been vetted and agreed upon now. The problem, so I'm teaching this in part because I think transportation engineers, like, we often put out our end all be all design from the get-go, right? And I would argue that design is iterative, design is incremental. Like, we should be putting out tactical urban, like, cheaper, less expensive, quicker builds to see what it's like, to give people a chance to feel it, to see it, to respond to it, and learn from it. We can double down on what works and we can pull back on stuff that doesn't. And if engineers treated road safety and design in that way, I think we'd be able to be a lot more nimble, a lot quicker, and get better stuff out there. But oftentimes we go into our CAD and we work for a year on a study of something and we never actually get things done. So that would be more top down. You're talking about more bottom up. I mean, I'm friends with like Mike Lydon, and like the stuff they started with this is incredible. Like, so we do need more of it. Um, and a lot of cities, I know Denver has an official program where as a citizen, you can actually submit something to get a kind of a permit to do a tactical urbanism experiment yourself. So I think it needs to be some back and forth on this, but yeah, I mean, transportation, it helps when people see it, feel it, taste it, and they otherwise, like my neighbors in Connecticut, like I said, they didn't know what they were missing because they'd never had a chance to see it. And that's the case with a lot of stuff. And then once they do it and get a chance to, a lot of times people's minds change.
I would give a shout out to Strong Towns, Portland, that has they paint these crosswalks near schools, or they painted a couple crosswalks that have like a fish swimming through it, so it's really kind of, it looks nice, it's cute. And I told them when the city comes down to grind that down, you need to have like some kids out, get the drama department out there to be crying as much as they can or whatever, because it's like it can, I don't know, I think like sometimes you do need to push a little bit harder, ask
That's
first, but then
that's like that story in the Power Broker where the woman gets everyone to come out with their baby carriages to fight again. Like, it's the one time people kind of successfully fought Bob Moses, was like using that mentality.
Okay, so there is a recurring theme in your book telling the stories of studies or pamphlets that are promoted over time into something that was maybe never intended, right? Like, and you talked about this like a gospel kind of, your traffic engineer with the book, the graphic you had at the end. And in a lot of cases, these don't hold up to simple scrutiny. You gave examples of, Forrester's study on vehicular recycling or Norman Mark's study on grid that you showed. Um, and the foundations of parking mandates are similarly shaky, as you brought a lot. Now, I do think like, you know, what what are the most effective strategies you can give for activists to dispelling this veneer of scientific authority in the minds of the public and policymakers? What are some there's similar attacks, things we can take away too?
Well, I mean, so despite the title, I'm not trying to blame the traffic engineers a lot because they don't know any better. Like we were taught there's 100 years of science, that everything we're doing is steeped in all this scientific inquiry. And then like when you start looking at Donald Shoup's work, you start realizing what a farce that is. And a lot of people still think it's just related to parking, but it's almost everywhere. Like every rabbit hole I started digging down, you see how quickly it falls apart. So I mean, my hope is that we can. I feel like traffic engineering and transportation has become more theory based and empirical based. So to bring it back more to an empirical science where like we are doing iterative designs like that, and at the same time, I want to help advocates and folks like that that are fighting the good fight to understand where there's pushback because there's a lot more leeway to what traffic engineers do. Like we have the term is engineering judgment. Like we have so much leeway to use that. And there are protocols we can use to make sure there's no liability issues, but we will use terms and phrases. And like that's what I talked about at that CNU class that can shut down an argument, that can shut down a conversation. Like we use a word standard. Like what does that really mean? It's really more of a guideline. And even then we have some leeway. So I feel like if like when I go to a public meeting and I watch things unfold, it's hard for me because I get angry. Like when the engineer starts saying stuff that I know is just not quite true. So I want to arm people with that information so they too can more effectively argue with an engineer and know where there is pushback. Because there's a lot more than we think, and to be honest, there's more than most traffic engineers think.
Great. There are a lot of good questions. So I think I'm gonna maybe ask two more off of my list here, and then we'll jump in. So in the one of the final chapters of your book, Another One Rides a Bus, and I think you touched on this in your slides. You shared that a 1% increase in transit ridership correlates to a 3% decrease in fatal crashes. And a Brookings report last year using our parking lot maps found a very strong correlation between transit ridership and the amount of land dedicated to parking in downtown. So you can kind of connect the dots, like got a lot of parking downtown. If you reduce the parking downtown, maybe you can reduce fatalities. Now, obviously, correlation is not causation. Are these correlations deeper than coincidence? And what could be the mechanism or what research is needed to prove this relation?
I mean, long story short, they are like they're not coincidences. I mean, it's hard to prove causation, but I mean, I mentioned Chris McCahill's paper. He did like an 8-step plan to show causation, and he showed that it was the parking that preceded the driving, not vice versa. So there are ways to do that, but to be honest, it's common sense. We need to be honest with ourselves sometimes. It's like we can always say correlation, not causation, but like we all know too, talked about this a few times, like we're responding to the built environment. Like when all we're seeing is big roads and big parking lots, like we respond rationally to that, and you start driving and you probably start driving bigger cars. And given the world we built, it makes sense for a lot of people to do that, but that's our fault for building that world.
I think that's, I mean, I'll share, I mean, a lot of times in my discussions with policymakers or people, it is, they ask for data, and a lot of times like, what are you going to do with this data? If I give you a paper, are you going to read it? Are you going to understand it? Like, what are you going to do with it? Some of this is really common sense, or it's just logical. Like you don't need, or someone said, like, hey, our city is 30% downtown, 30% of downtown is parking. Is that too much? I was like, go over there and see if it's a fun place to go. Do you like being there? Like, is it too much or too little? I don't know, but what does it tell you? Like, is it telling you drive to me or take a bus or hang out here or come and leave? So I think you're definitely,
Well, that's why I suggest like finding the places you love, go out, look at them, see how they operate, like measure them, look to see how much parking they actually have. Like, remember that book Visualizing Density? I think I have it up there where like they have different chapters, like this is how many units per acre, and you actually see what it looks like. You could do something similar for parking. Like this is what, 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area looks like. And like have that same thing. You can start understanding what it leads to. Like, 'cause when you see some of those parking regulations and they don't look, that threatening on a piece of paper, right? Oh, you need one parking space per whatever. But when you actually understand what that looks like and how much we all have a visceral hatred of places like that, like it starts to come together. And, you know, so I think maybe connecting those dots would help.
Right. I loved when you talked about like tried and tested, like, look at the place, this idea of looking at places. A lot of times people want to know what is going to be the impact if we get like what's happened if when we get rid of parking mandates. And it's like, well, Hartford, really, I think has a claim to the crown of, really going first all out. 2018, there's some evidence, but there's not a lot of time. But I tell people, well, go back to look at stuff that was built in the 40s, and that could, like you can almost look back to see what could be coming back in the future. Like we've prevented these kinds of places from being built, and hopefully we can return to this kind of form to some degree, updated of course, and more accessible to people in wheelchairs and things like that, but similar scale and scope. Okay, the last question I'll ask is around on-street parking and occupancy, and I kind of want to get at this because we get in the parking reform world, there's kind of a push around, I often get people, want to remove all on-street parking or prevent it, like in Japan or just in some cities in Japan, where you have to have an off-street parking space. And we'll get this idea, that on-street parking is, important for safety in some streets. And I want to kind of break down a little bit more on that and just think, how should we as parking reformers think about like on-street parking and occupancy? Should we really like, are there other uses that could have a similar traffic calming effect? Like, we don't always want to require this stuff for parking all the time, I guess. There's a trade-off. And obviously, yeah. So I'm curious just your
Yeah.
thoughts on how that
Oh
works
yeah,
out in the long
and
run.
back when we did that study, I mean, parklets were not a thing, right? We weren't having dining on the street. So there are far better uses for street space than storing someone's personal property there for hours on end, right? At the same time, you can imagine how, having cars in between where the moving traffic is and where the pedestrians or bicyclists are can provide safety, right? So there are some ways we can use it, but I would not just go all out. We need more on-street parking. I mean, at the same time, if we feel like we need a certain amount of parking, it's much more space efficient than an off-street service lot, right? Like maybe not as much as a parking garage, but so I think understanding where it falls in sort of the land consumption spectrum and understanding how we can use it in certain instances, um, it becomes different too. Now we have like Uber and Lyft and things like that, and they're using, or Amazon package trucks, like they're using our curb space differently. So it's a more complicated problem than it was back then. But I mean, at the time, like I was a consultant. We were doing these projects in these small New England town centers. Um, and there would be a state road coming through it, and the state DOT would be like, oh, you can't have on-street parking here. And these little town centers would look like a Norman Rockwell painting, but except for the road cutting through it. And if they just changed that, and sometimes on-street parking would help. So there are cases where it does make sense, but I would not just say, hey, it's better for safety, do it everywhere. It's not that simple.
Yeah, I guess we didn't talk. I mean, we haven't touched because it's not really the topic here, but on-street parking management, right? If you're pricing your curbs properly, you have an idea of that helps you to at least get a baseline of what the highest use could be, because it could be what a restaurant's willing to pay for it, or you can, as you shift off-street parking somewhere else, it provides more incentive for people to park in off-street lots and that already exist, or off-street garages. So like balancing that, that's a lot of, I think the next frontier in parking reform is really getting to managing curbs in the service of building better cities, or regulating them.
It's so sad that we're still not pricing it right. I mean, that was one of the first, I think, shoe papers I read, was just about how we underprice the street and overprice the garages. So everyone is just, I mean, the famous George Costanza clip when he's looking for a street space, and every city I go to, we're still doing it the same way. Like we haven't fixed the basics, except in rare instances. Like, got to get that right, because everyone is out here looking for a street space and no one wants to park in the garages.
Right. Well, I'm gonna kick this back over to Daniel, who I think has been watching we got 22 questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to kick back over to him and he's going to ask you a couple of those.
Thanks, Tony. And yeah, apologies to all who asked questions. We got about 10 minutes left to go here, just to kind of keep us on time. There are some common threads in the questions that I'm going to pull out. So it may mean that, I don't ask your question verbatim the way you typed it. But I'm going to try to really get at the spirit of the questions that we're seeing people ask, the ones that have some recurring themes or that are getting upvoted a lot. And we'll get to as much as we can here. So one recurring theme I see in maybe about 5 of the questions in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to sort of synthesize here, is what hopeful signs do you see of change in the profession, and specifically, I would say in engineering education? Are there curricular changes happening? Is there really sort of a mindset change in how the up and coming generation of transportation engineers are being taught to think about these issues? And where is their progress? What's the next thing that really you would like to see happen in terms of the educational environment?
So very much so. I mean, so many young engineers I see, and not just the ones I'm teaching, but when I go to conferences, like they're like they know something isn't right, like what they've been taught, like things aren't adding up, and they're excited to find a different answer, different solution. So when I talk about these things, like they are often the first ones on board and sort of jumping on it. There's obviously some resistance from a small cohort of older engineers who just think if people just behave like the way we tell them to, we'd all be safe, and that's enough. But I mean, I think it's obvious if you kind of go through these topics, like the human error falsehood, that it's just not the case, and we can do better. And we need to educate our engineers in that same vein. So in the book, I have a whole section on education, and I think a lot of people would say that traffic engineering is too siloed. And, I think it makes sense to some extent, but I only took one transportation engineering class as an undergraduate, and I got my PE in this. And I thought that was rare. Like maybe I took less than other people, but it was pretty common. Some people took maybe 2 or 3. Other people I know took 0. Like, so they got the professional engineering license in transportation engineering and civil engineering, having never taken a single transportation course, let alone a road safety course or anything like that. So it's sort of amazing how little we teach them. So we don't even know enough to be siloed. And they also don't know enough to do anything but what the guidebooks tell them. So when I'm a young engineer and I only took one class in this, and they pound all these 1,000-page guidebooks on my desk, I don't have enough knowledge to use my engineering judgment. I don't have engineering judgment. So I sort of have to follow the guidebook. So we need, I think, to rethink our education to actually educate them to do better. Like, so it seems crazy when you sort of hear that story, but that's the way it is. And most people working this field, like when I went back to get my master's, I mean, started taking more classes. I'd only taken 1. I took like 10 more. I quickly realized that I knew nothing. And it was like starting over, but I'd already reached sort of what some people consider the pinnacle, getting your PE. And it seemed just crazy to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to drill down a little bit, again, in the spirit of a couple of these questions about sort of the cult of the standard. And in particular, the way that may be perceived by ultimately, by political decision makers. So I'm riffing a little bit on one of the questions here about when traffic engineers propose a street design and they claim it's safer, but I'm skeptical, because of all the things we've talked about here, because of things I know. Is the question that was posed to the Q&A was, is there somewhere I can go to ask true safety experts to weigh in, some kind of forum, subreddit with experts like yourself? Or can I email you with a smiley face? I might even expand the question a little more broadly. Like, if I'm a community advocate and some change is proposed to a road in my neighborhood, and I am, I want to marshal my arguments before the city council, and I'm up against this sort of cult of, well, it's the standard, or well, level of service, or all those things that we've heard trotted out. Like, what do I do to prepare for that sort of advocacy? And what do I do when I know that I'm going to be confronted with, well, you're not a PE?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So in the book, I go through, a lot of the protocols that traffic engineers are using, things like, we're trying to design our roads for capacity, and not even capacity today. We're like a capacity 20 years into the future. And we think that safety is going to come by doing that. Same thing with like speed limits. Like the way we typically set speed limits is with like the 85th percentile. So we let drivers vote with their feet how fast they want to drive. And our thinking is, well, that's good because then they're all going to be within like the same pace, and that will lead to safety. In both cases, like the research doesn't hold up. Like there aren't safety benefits. Like with something like level service, like the first iteration, they said we need to go back and add safety to this. In the next version of that book, they removed that sentence. We never added safety to it. So engineers are taught safety is part of these things, but it's not. Like we aren't actually looking at safety. So when like a traffic engineer will increase your speed limit telling you it's going to be safer, it's just not true. So I mean, hopefully the book can provide some ammunition for folks to help with those arguments. In terms of a place they can go, oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe groups like the Parking Reform Network or CNU, Strong Towns. Like there's a lot of people that are very passionate about this that are digging in. So it's hard to like sometimes when I even look at Reddit, like, oh, that was a really good answer from somebody. Like, but it's hit or miss.
A lot of the work is mindset change, and that's certainly been a theme tonight. It's not just this one decision, but it's over and over again. How can we um get people approaching the question in a different way?
A lot of
Wes,
times we're just asking the wrong basic things. Like, I mean, as a country, like we're just so focused on reducing traffic congestion. I would say that's the wrong basic question. Like we should be asking how to get people to jobs, to schools, to opportunities, to social things. And when you sort of think about it more like accessing those places, you get a bigger subset of answers, which could include land use and moving like where A and B are closer together. But when we just focus on traffic congestion, you end up increasing the number of lanes on the highway. Or like in Denver, we put most of our light rails right along the corridors where the highways were. The thinking is they would reduce traffic congestion. Like none of that is true. We've for 100 years failed at reducing traffic congestion. Like everything other than congestion pricing is a waste of time. But I would also say we're not asking the right question. The goal isn't to reduce traffic congestion. That's one of the ways we can help people access places and destinations, but it isn't, the goal. It's just one of the things we should consider as in our toolbox.
right. One here that's maybe a little more technical, but I know I'm certainly interested in the answer to this. The cul-de-sac versus the gridded street network and the sort of the safety implications of that. Does the cul-de-sac model become better provided that there are cut-throughs for bikes and pedestrians? So kind of that filtered permeability model. Do you know of any?
Yeah. So when I looked at, so the problem is in the United States, we did not have enough of those examples for me to really study. Like there were a couple in my data set. If you look at like Davis, California, and the Village Homes area, like you look at the street map and it looks like all these cul-de-sacs, but if you zoom in closer, it's a fully gridded network for the pedestrians and the bicyclists. Same goes with like in Berkeley, California, even though it's a grid, they have a lot of diverters. So it's not a grid for cars, it's a grid for bicyclists and pedestrians. And like if you look at the data, like some of those places were actually safer, but I did not have enough of them to be statistically significant. If you look to Europe, they have more of those places. So you could imagine that that's the case. At the same time, by pushing all the cars to like the big arterials, and if we're still following the same protocols that I laid out before, like the 20 years into the future, like we end up building arterials that are like 8 lanes wide. So like those cities would still kill a lot of people given like what I'm finding. So we'd have to restrain ourselves. So we have to not turn those arterials into these massive stroads. If we can do that and do what we want to do in terms of limiting car traffic drivers cutting through the network to make it more pedestrian bike friendly, it would be great. I gave Peter Firth, he's a professor from Northeastern. He was in town yesterday. I gave him a tour of a lot of, it's a bike network, a low stress bike network in sort of Northwest Denver. And they did a great job of looking at it from a network perspective, where it actually connects destinations like parks to schools to restaurants. And they did it from a network perspective where there's diverters, there's chokers, there's corner bulb outs, there's speed humps, and it made for a great environment. But if they also tried to expand the arterials because they did that, it would not have worked.
I think we have time for one more here. And I feel like I should do the most upvoted question in the Q&A tab, which is, hi Wes, I find minimum parking requirements for bars in particular to be a Have you or anyone else studied the relationship between bars, parking, and drunk driving?
No, I mean, I haven't, but and some of the people that are, trying to fight me on the idea that we really should be blaming people for bad decisions. Like, yes, for the sake of liability, for the police, for the insurance companies, we should hold people responsible for drunk driving. At the same time, we engineers and planners can't just treat these things as solely like their responsibility. Like when we design a bar and we put it in the middle of nowhere, we put a big parking lot, we don't give people any other way to get there. Like, what the hell do we expect? Like we could engineer it differently and put the bar in a more accessible place where there's other mode options. We could, even thinking to policies for cars and trucks, we could make it harder to drive when you're drunk, where you have to actually, so if you've been caught drunk driving, you might have the interlock system, but there are ways to engineer it. And that's a case where maybe technology could help, but we don't do any of that. We just tell people to do better, be better. So I would argue that we should be treating sort of every fatal severe injury crash as something that maybe engineering can do something about, including bars with minimum parking requirements in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. We are at about an hour and a half here, so I want to wrap us up. Thank you. This has been fantastic. We've had really spectacular attendance here. Great conversation, great questions. Apologies to everyone who asked a question that we didn't have a chance to answer live, but I know we're gonna collect that chat transcript. We're gonna share that with Wes, and we're going to we've got someone who um, has volunteered to kind of format questions and put that all together. Thank you, Bridget, for that. And we are going to be sharing the recording in a couple weeks. It'll certainly be in the PRN newsletter. We'll let our Slack know. It'll be out there in the world. Um, um, Wes Marshall, if people would like to get in touch with you after this, if they got further questions, or is there a way that they should contact you?
Yeah, no, they can try to email me. I just haven't had time to answer them all. I'm spending like 2 or 3 hours just answering emails every day, and I can't do my real job as much as I should be doing. So it's hard. But I mean, it's awesome that people are interested and excited, and they're asking great questions. I'm getting great feedback. So, I mean, to be honest, thank you guys for having me. Thank everyone for coming and caring. We need you all in this world.
Thanks so much, Wes.
That's the way to close it. Yes, thank you so much.